Greetings, traveller. The morning mist clung to the harbour of Port Aldwyn like a familiar shroud, threading between the masts of merchant vessels and naval ships with equal indifference. From the quarterdeck of the Oath of the Dawn, Junior Officer Aren Valen watched the sun struggle to pierce the grey veil, its pale light casting everything in muted silver. The brigantine rocked gently at anchor, her twin masts swaying in perfect rhythm with the tide, and Aren found himself mesmerized by the movement, the endless, hypnotic dance of wood and water that had called to him since childhood. Valen. The gruff voice of Captain Mordecai Thorne cut through his reverie like a blade through silk. The supply manifest won't review itself. Aren straightened, his hand moving instinctively to adjust his blue naval coat. At 23, he was the youngest officer aboard the Oath, a position earned through academic excellence rather than seasoned experience. The distinction was not lost on his crewmates, who regarded him with the mixture of tolerance and mild amusement typically reserved for eager puppies. "Aye, Captain," Aren replied, though his gaze lingered on the horizon, where the mist seemed to thicken into something more substantial, more mysterious. Somewhere beyond that curtain of grey lay waters that most sailors refused to name aloud, seas where legends were born and ships vanished without trace. Captain Thorne followed his gaze and shook his head with the weary patience of a man who had shepherded many young officers through their romantic notions of the sea. "The Black Stillwater again, is it? Lad, you'd do better to focus on the pirates we know exist rather than chasing sailors' tales." The Black Stillwater. Even hearing the name spoken sent a curious thrill through Aren's chest. A sensation he had never quite been able to explain. For as long as he could remember, the legend had haunted his thoughts like a half-remembered dream. Stories told in taverns spoke of cursed waters where fog never lifted, where compasses spun wildly before falling still, pointing toward nothing at all. And somewhere in those waters, according to the tales, drifted the Ashen Crown, a ship crewed by the dead, visible only to those who had already lost their way. "With respect, Captain," Aren said carefully, "every legend has some foundation in truth. The number of vessels that have vanished in those waters can be explained by natural hazards," Thorne interrupted, though not unkindly. "Reefs, storms, navigational errors. The sea is dangerous enough without conjuring ghosts to explain every mishap." He placed a weathered hand on Aren's shoulder. "You have promise, Valen. Don't waste it chasing shadows." Aren nodded dutifully, but as Captain Thorne walked away, his thoughts remained fixed on those distant waters. There was something about the legend that called to him, something that felt less like superstition and more like destiny waiting to be fulfilled. He had read every account he could find, studied every map that bore even the faintest mark where the Black Stillwater was said to begin. Most scholars dismissed such charts as the products of fevered imagination, but Aren saw patterns in the testimonies, consistencies that suggested truth hidden beneath layers of embellishment. The sound of boots on deck drew his attention to First Officer Henrik Calder, a sturdy man in his 40s whose pragmatic nature had served him well through 15 years of naval service. Calder approached with the measured stride of someone who had learned to waste neither time nor energy on the unpredictable deck of a ship. "Orders came in during the night watch," Calder said, handing Aren a sealed document. "We're to set sail for Carith's Reach within the hour. Smuggling operation needs disruption, apparently." Aren accepted the orders, though the mention of Carith's Reach sent an unexpected chill through him. The coastal city had once been a thriving port, but plague and economic collapse had reduced it to a shadow of its former glory. Now it served as a haven for those whom fortune had abandoned, criminals, deserters, and broken sailors who had nowhere else to turn. It was exactly the sort of place where desperate men might gather, men who had little left to lose. "Carith's Reach," Aren murmured, turning the name over in his mind like a key that might unlock something significant. "How long are we expected to remain there?" Calder shrugged. "Until the job is done. Could be days, could be weeks. Why? You have somewhere else you'd rather be?" Aren almost smiled at the question. If only Calder knew how accurately he had struck at the heart of things. "No, sir. I was merely curious about the timeline." As the oath of the dawn made ready to depart, Aren stood at the rail and watched Port Aldwin fade into the morning haze. The familiar sounds of a ship under sail, the creak of rigging, the snap of canvas catching wind, the rhythmic splash of waves against the hull, should have filled him with the contentment he always felt when at sea. Instead, he found himself consumed by a restless energy, a sense that events were aligning in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. The voyage to Carith's Reach took 3 days, during which Aren threw himself into his duties with an intensity that drew curious glances from his fellow officers. He reviewed the supply manifests twice, inspected the armory with unusual thoroughness, and spent long hours studying charts of the coastal waters. To the casual observer, he appeared to be simply demonstrating the enthusiasm expected of a junior officer. In reality, he was laying groundwork for something far more ambitious. On the second evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and gold, Aren found himself alone in the chart room. The chamber was small and cramped, its walls lined with maps and nautical instruments, but it had become his sanctuary during the voyage. By the light of a swaying lantern, he spread out a collection of charts he had been gathering for months, unofficial documents obtained through discreet inquiries and careful trades with merchant captains who had sailed beyond the usual shipping lanes. Most of the maps bore the standard warnings about the Black Stillwater. Waters unknown, navigation unreliable, proceed with extreme caution. But a few, drawn by captains who claimed to have sailed close enough to peer into those legendary waters, showed more detail. Currents were marked, wind patterns noted, and in one case, a rough outline suggested the presence of an uncharted island. Aren traced the boundaries of the cursed waters with his finger, noting how different cartographers had marked slightly different locations for the same phenomena. The variations might have been dismissed as inconsistency, but to his eyes they suggested something else entirely, that the Black Stillwater itself might shift and change, appearing in different places at different times. If true, it would explain why so few expeditions had successfully located the region, and why those that did often never returned. A soft knock at the door interrupted his study. Aren quickly rolled up the charts, replacing them with standard navigational maps of the coastal waters near Carith's Reach. "Enter." Midshipman Torres stepped into the room, a young man barely older than Aren himself, but with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent his life at sea. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Captain Thorn requests your presence on deck. We should sight Carith's Reach within the hour." "Thank you, Torres. I'll be up directly." Alone again, Aren carefully secured his private charts in a waterproof pouch. Tomorrow they would dock in Carith's Reach, and he would have his first real opportunity to act on the plans that had been taking shape in his mind. The thought filled him with equal measures of excitement and trepidation, but beneath both emotions lay a deeper certainty that his destiny lay somewhere beyond the edge of the known world, in waters where dead men sailed eternal ships and legends took on flesh and bone. The first glimpse of Carith's Reach came as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the crumbling city in hues that made its decay seem almost beautiful. Once, the port had boasted impressive stone quays and warehouses that stretched along the waterfront like the ribs of some great beast. Now, many of those structures stood empty, their windows dark and their walls stained with salt and neglect. The harbour itself remained functional, though barely. Wooden docks sagged under their own weight, and the water was clouded with debris that spoke of poor maintenance and poorer prospects. "Cheerful place," Calder muttered as he joined Aren at the rail. "I can see why the smugglers chose it. Half the city looks abandoned." Aren studied the waterfront with different eyes, noting not the decay, but the possibilities it represented. Desperate places bred desperate people, and desperate people might be willing to take risks that others would refuse. Among the handful of vessels anchored in the harbour, he could see ships that had clearly seen better days. Merchant vessels with patched sails and fishing boats held together by hope and tar. Their crews would be men who understood that fortune favoured the bold, even when boldness led toward dangerous waters. The Oath of the Dawn dropped anchor as the last light of day faded into purple twilight. Captain Thorn gathered his officers for a final briefing, outlining their mission to disrupt the smuggling operation that had been using Carith's Reach as a base. The plan was straightforward: establish a presence in the port, gather intelligence on the smugglers' operations, and coordinate with local authorities to apprehend the criminals. "We'll be here for at least a week," Thorn concluded. "Possibly longer, depending on what we uncover. Valen, I want you to work with the Harbour Master's office. Review shipping records and identify suspicious patterns. Calder, you'll coordinate with what passes for law enforcement in this place." Aren nodded, though privately he recognized the assignment as an opportunity rather than a mere duty. The Harbour Master's office would give him access to records of every ship that had docked in Carith's Reach, along with information about their crews and destinations. More importantly, it would provide cover for him to move freely through the port, observing and evaluating potential recruits for his own purposes. That night, as the crew of the Oath settled into watches and routine maintenance, Aren lay in his narrow bunk and stared at the darkness above him. Through the hull, he could hear the gentle lap of waves against the harbour walls and the distant sounds of a city that never quite slept. Voices carrying across the water, the creak of rigging in the night breeze, the occasional splash of something hitting the water. Kareth's reach might be decaying, but it was far from dead. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of everything he had been planning. The thought should have filled him with nervous energy, but instead he felt a curious calm, as if he was simply following a path that had been laid out for him long ago. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in waters shrouded by perpetual mist, the Ashen Crown drifted through legends and nightmares. And somehow, despite all logic and reason, Aren knew that he was meant to find her. The morning brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the cobblestones of Kareth's Reach slick and treacherous. Aren made his way through the winding streets toward the harbour master's office, noting how the weather seemed to emphasize the city's decline. Paint peeled from building facades in long, leprous strips, and puddles collected in streets where proper drainage had long since failed. Yet there was life here too, merchants hawking goods from beneath canvas awnings, children playing in the narrow alleys, and sailors from various ships conducting the sort of business that kept ports alive despite their flaws. The harbour master's office occupied a squat stone building near the central docks, its interior dimly lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with ledgers and charts. The harbour master himself proved to be a thin, nervous man named Kellen Wraith, whose pale complexion and darting eyes suggested someone who had spent too many years dealing with the sort of people who preferred to conduct their business in shadow. "Naval inspection, is it?" Wraith said, wringing his hands as he led Aren to a desk piled high with shipping records. "I assure you, Officer Valen, we maintain all required documentation. Everything is in order, completely legitimate." Aren smiled reassuringly, though he noticed how Wraith's protests came before any accusations had been made. "I'm certain it is, Master Wraith. We're simply investigating reports of unusual shipping activity. If you could provide access to your records from the past few months, I'll try not to disrupt your normal operations." For the next several hours, Aren immersed himself in the mundane details of maritime commerce, cargo manifests, crew rosters, port fees, and departure schedules. Most of it was exactly what he had expected to find, legitimate trade mixed with the sort of minor infractions that were common in struggling ports. But gradually, he began to identify patterns that interested him far more than evidence of smuggling. Certain ships appeared repeatedly in the records, vessels whose crews seemed to change frequently and whose stated destinations often proved vague or inconsistent. More telling were the notations that appeared in Wraith's personal logs, comments about sailors who had abandoned their ships, captains who had disappeared without settling their port fees, and crew members who spent their time in the taverns telling strange stories about waters that shouldn't exist. One entry in particular caught Aren's attention, a notation about the merchant vessel Wind's Promise, whose captain had reportedly gone mad during a voyage to the far southern waters. According to Wraith's careful script, the man had been found wandering the docks at dawn, muttering about ships made of bone and shadow and waters that drink the light from stars. The Wind's Promise had departed the next day with a new captain, but 3 crew members had refused to sail and remained in Kareth's Reach, taking work on fishing boats that never ventured far from shore. By evening, Aren had compiled a mental list of nearly 24 men who might be suitable for his purposes. Sailors who had been abandoned by their ships, former naval personnel who had deserted their posts, and fishermen whose vessels had been lost to storm or misfortune. All of them shared certain characteristics. They were experienced enough to be useful, desperate enough to take risks, and isolated enough that their disappearance would not immediately attract attention. As darkness settled over Kareth's Reach, Aren made his way through the maze of taverns and boarding houses that clustered near the waterfront. The rain had stopped, but moisture still hung in the air like a promise of storms to come. Lamplight spilled from windows and doorways, creating pools of yellow warmth in the narrow streets, and the sound of voices and laughter suggested that the night's business was just beginning. The first establishment he entered was called the Broken Anchor, a tavern whose name proved prophetic in its accuracy. The common room was thick with pipe smoke and the smell of fish stew, while conversation flowed as freely as the ale. Oren ordered a drink and found a table near the back, content to observe and listen as sailors shared stories of their voyages and misfortunes. It didn't take long to identify potential recruits. Near the bar, a weather-beaten man with rope-scarred hands complained loudly about captains who abandoned their crews without pay. At a corner table, 2 younger sailors discussed their unsuccessful attempts to find berths on merchant vessels bound for more prosperous ports. And, standing alone near the fireplace, nursing a tankard of ale with the careful attention of a man making his drink last as long as possible, was someone who immediately captured Aren's attention. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with the lean build and steady gaze of an experienced sailor, but there was something in his posture that spoke of recent disappointment, a tension that suggested he was carrying burdens heavier than mere poverty. When he occasionally glanced toward the other patrons, his eyes held the particular wariness of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from the world. Aren approached casually, signaling the barkeeper for another round of drinks. "Mind if I join you? The other tables seem to be claimed by rather loud company." The man studied him for a moment, taking in the quality of Aren's clothes and the bearing that marked him as someone accustomed to command. "Free country," he said finally, though his tone suggested that freedom was a concept he had reason to doubt. "Aren Valen," Aren said, extending his hand as he settled into the chair across from the stranger. "Marcus Dane." The handshake was firm and brief. "You're not local. Navy, unless I miss my guess." "What gave me away?" Dane's smile held no warmth. "Everything. The way you walk, the way you observe the room, the fact that your hands are soft enough to belong to an officer rather than a working sailor." He took a sip of his ale. "The question is what a naval officer wants with the likes of me." Aren had prepared for this moment, but sitting across from Dane, he felt the weight of what he was about to set in motion. Once he spoke the words that had been forming in his mind for months, there would be no retreating to the safety of his position aboard the Oath of the Dawn. He would be committed to a course of action that could end in glory or disaster, with very little ground between the two possibilities. "I'm looking for men with experience and courage," he said finally. Men who understand that the greatest opportunities often require the greatest risks. Dane's eyes sharpened with interest, though his expression remained carefully neutral. That's a dangerous thing to say to a stranger, Officer Valen, especially in a place like this, where loyalty can be purchased for the price of a good meal. Perhaps, Aren agreed, but something tells me you're not the sort of man who sells information for copper coins. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the scarred wooden table while the sounds of the tavern continued around them. Finally, Dane leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to a level that would not carry beyond their immediate vicinity. What sort of opportunity are we discussing? And there it was, the question that would transform speculation into action, dreams into reality. Aren felt his pulse quicken as he prepared to speak words that would change everything. The sort that legends are made of, he said quietly. The sort that most men lack the vision to pursue. The conversation with Marcus Dane stretched deep into the night, moving from the crowded tavern to a quiet corner of the harbor where their words could not be overheard. Under the pale light of a half-moon, Aren found himself revealing more of his intentions than he had planned, drawn out by Dane's careful questions and evident experience. The former merchant sailor, for that was what Dane had been before his ship was lost to pirates, listened with the attention of a man who understood that desperate times called for desperate measures. The Black Stillwater, Dane repeated when Aren finally spoke the name aloud. You're talking about sailing into cursed waters to find a ship that may not exist, crewed by dead men who certainly don't exist. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark harbor where the masts of anchored vessels swayed like skeletal fingers. And you believe this will bring you glory. I believe it will bring meaning, Aren corrected. There are patterns in the accounts, consistencies that suggest truth beneath the legend. Ships have vanished in those waters, Dane. Good ships with experienced crews. They didn't simply sink. They disappeared without leaving debris, without survivors, without explanation. Dane turned to study Aren's face in the moonlight. And what makes you think we'd fare any better? It was a fair question, one that Aren had asked himself countless times during the months of planning. The honest answer was that he had no guarantee of success, no certainty that skill and determination would be enough to survive an encounter with whatever haunted those waters. What he had instead was a conviction that felt deeper than logic, a certainty that his destiny lay somewhere beyond the edge of the known world. Because we won't be seeking them for gold or glory, he said finally. The legends all agree on one point. The Ashen Crown reveals itself only to those who are already lost. Perhaps that's the key. Perhaps we need to be truly desperate before we can find what we're looking for. Dane laughed, a sound with more bitterness than humor. Desperate? Look around you, Valen. Half the men in this port fit that description. If desperation were enough, every broken sailor in Kareth's Reach would have found your ghost ship by now. Not that kind of desperation, Aren said, the words coming to him as he spoke them. The kind that comes from having nothing left to lose, from choosing to sail into the unknown rather than accept defeat. He paused, watching Dane's expression carefully. From taking a ship and claiming it as your own. The implications of his words settled between them like a weight. Dane's eyes widened slightly as he grasped what Aren was suggesting, and, for a moment, the only sounds were the gentle lap of waves against the harbour walls and the distant voices of late-night revellers. "You're talking about mutiny," Dane said quietly. "About seizing a naval vessel and turning pirate." "I'm talking about claiming the tools we need to pursue a goal that no conventional expedition would support," Aren replied. "The Oath of the Dawn is a sound ship with experienced crew. In the right hands, she could survive waters that would claim lesser vessels. And Captain Thorn, your fellow officers, you'd abandon them here." The question struck at something Aren had been trying not to examine too closely. Captain Thorn had been kind to him, patient with his inexperience, and generous with his knowledge. First Officer Calder was a good man who had never shown him anything but professional courtesy. To betray them would be to cross a line from which there could be no return. They would be left safely ashore, he said, hearing the inadequacy of his words even as he spoke them. No harm would come to them. Dane was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving between Aren's face and the dark outline of the Oath of the Dawn, where she lay at anchor. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that made Aren's pulse quicken. "How many men would you need?" The question opened floodgates that Aren had been holding back for months. Over the next hour, he outlined his plans with the thoroughness of someone who had spent countless sleepless nights working through every detail. The Oath carried a crew of 32 men, but nearly half of them would be ashore at any given time, conducting business or simply enjoying their limited liberty. A coordinated action by a dozen determined men could secure the ship and subdue any resistance from the remaining crew. We'd need sailors who can handle a brigantine in difficult waters, Aren explained, men with experience in navigation, gunnery, and seamanship. But most importantly, we need people who understand that this isn't about piracy or profit. It's about pursuing something greater than ourselves. Dane nodded slowly. I know men who might be interested. Sailors who've lost their ships, naval deserters who can't go home, fishermen whose luck has run out. But convincing them won't be easy. The Black Stillwater has a reputation that goes beyond simple danger. Fear can be overcome, Aren said. Despair is harder to fight. Show them a purpose, a chance to be part of something legendary, and they'll follow. And if we find this ship of yours, if the Ashen Crown proves to be more than legend? It was the question Aren had been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. All his planning had focused on the search itself, on the challenge of reaching the Black Stillwater and proving that the legends contained truth. What would happen if they actually encountered the cursed vessel was a problem he had left for future consideration. We'll face that when it comes, he said finally. But I'd rather die pursuing something meaningful than live safely in mediocrity. By the time they parted that night, agreements had been made and plans set in motion. Dane would approach potential recruits with careful discretion, feeling out their desperation and their courage in equal measure. Aren would continue his duties aboard the Oath, maintaining the appearance of a conscientious junior officer while gathering intelligence about watch schedules and security procedures. They would meet again in 3 nights to assess their progress and finalize their preparations. The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness as Aren forced himself to maintain his normal routines. He reviewed shipping records with Master Wraith, filed reports on suspicious cargo movements, and participated in the mundane tasks that kept a naval vessel functioning. But beneath the surface, his awareness had sharpened to an almost painful degree. Every conversation with his fellow officers felt like a betrayal in advance. Every order from Captain Thorn reminded him of the trust he was preparing to violate. The hardest moment came on the second evening when Thorn invited him to share a drink in the captain's cabin. The space was cramped but comfortable, decorated with charts and mementos from Thorn's long career. A window at the stern looked out over the harbour, where lights from the city reflected on the dark water like fallen stars. "You've seemed distracted lately, Valen," Thorn said as he poured 2 glasses of rum from a bottle that bore the seal of the Royal Navy. "Something troubling you?" Aren accepted the drink, though the amber liquid suddenly seemed to burn his throat. "Just the nature of the assignment, sir. It's hard to see a place like this and not wonder how it came to such a state." Thorn nodded, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been stiffened by decades at sea. Kareth's reach wasn't always like this. 20 years ago, it was a thriving port with a bright future. But plague and politics have a way of destroying what took generations to build. He sipped his rum thoughtfully. "The people here aren't evil, just forgotten. Sometimes I think that's the worst fate of all, to be cast aside and left to rot while the world moves on without you." The words hit Aren with unexpected force, resonating with feelings he had been struggling to articulate. Wasn't that exactly what he feared for himself? To spend his life following orders and maintaining status quo, contributing nothing lasting to the world, leaving no mark that would survive his passing. The Black Stillwater represented something different, a chance to write his name in legend, to pursue mysteries that had captured human imagination for generations. "Sir," he said carefully, "do you ever regret choosing a life of service, following rules rather than charting your own course?" Thorn studied him with eyes that had seen too much to be easily deceived. "That's a dangerous question, lad, the kind that leads to dangerous answers." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "But I suppose every man wonders what might have been if he'd chosen differently. The key is learning to find meaning in the path you've actually walked, not the ones you left behind." After returning to his own quarters that night, Aren lay awake staring at the ceiling and wrestling with doubts that threatened to undermine his resolve. Thorn was a good man who deserved better than betrayal from a subordinate he had tried to mentor. The crew of the Oath were loyal sailors who had done nothing to earn abandonment in a foreign port. Even his mission to find the Ashen Crown, when examined in the cold light of reason, seemed less like destiny and more like the obsession of a young man desperate to prove his worth. But by morning, the doubts had faded, replaced by the familiar certainty that had been growing in his chest for months. Some paths could only be walked alone. Some goals could only be achieved by those willing to risk everything in their pursuit. History was written by men who had the courage to break from convention, not by those who followed orders and accepted limitations. The third night brought thick fog that rolled in from the sea like a living thing, muffling sounds and turning familiar streets into a maze of shadows and uncertainty. Aren made his way through the vapor-shrouded alleys of Kareth's Reach toward the predetermined meeting point, an abandoned warehouse near the edge of the port district where their conversation would not be interrupted or overheard. Dane was waiting for him, but he was not alone. 9 other men stood in the shadows of the warehouse, their faces barely visible in the dim light that filtered through broken windows. As Aren's eyes adjusted, he began to make out details that told him everything he needed to know about the recruits Dane had assembled. There was Willem Cord, a former gunner's mate from the Royal Navy, who had deserted after being passed over for promotion one too many times. Beside him stood the Torres brothers, Esteban and Raphael, fishermen whose boat had been lost in a storm and who had been scraping together a living doing odd jobs around the harbour. Near the wall, a thin man with nervous eyes introduced himself as Peter Marsh, a merchant sailor whose last captain had died of fever, leaving the crew stranded without pay or prospects. Each man had a story of loss, disappointment, or abandonment. Each had reached a point where conventional opportunities no longer seemed sufficient to restore their fortunes. And each, according to Dane's careful assessment, possessed the skills and desperation necessary to make Aren's plan feasible. "Gentlemen," Aren began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air of the warehouse, "you're here because you understand that sometimes extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. What I'm proposing will test your courage, your seamanship, and your willingness to pursue goals that others would call impossible." He outlined his plan with the same thoroughness he had shown Dane, explaining how they would seize the Oath of the Dawn and set course for waters that existed more in legend than on any official chart. He spoke of the Ashen Crown and the mysteries that surrounded it, painting a picture of adventure and discovery that made their current circumstances seem small and temporary. "This isn't piracy for profit," he emphasized. "This is exploration in pursuit of truth. We'll be seeking something that has eluded sailors for generations, something that could change our understanding of what's possible in this world." The questions came quickly. How would they overcome the loyal crew members? What supplies would they need for an extended voyage into unknown waters? How would they navigate without official charts or support from naval authorities? Aren had answers for most of their concerns, detailed responses that demonstrated the depth of his preparation and the seriousness of his commitment. But it was Willem Cord who asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "And if we find this ghost ship of yours, what then, Captain?" The title hit Aren like a physical blow, carrying with it the weight of command and responsibility that he had been preparing to accept. To be called captain by men who were entrusting their lives to his vision was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Then we'll face whatever we find with courage and determination," he replied. "The unknown is always dangerous, but it's also where all great discoveries are made. We'll be equipped with a sound ship, experienced crew, and the knowledge that we chose our fate rather than accepting what others decided for us. By the time the meeting ended, plans had been set in motion that would transform speculation into action within 48 hours. Each man had been assigned specific responsibilities. Cord would handle the weapons locker. The Torres brothers would secure the engine room. Marsh would deal with the ship's stores. Dane, as Aren's second-in-command, would coordinate the boarding and ensure that no loyal crew members were seriously harmed during the takeover. As the conspirators dispersed into the fog-shrouded streets, Aren felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that came with crossing points of no return. Tomorrow, he would perform his duties as a junior officer for the last time. The day after, he would either be the captain of his own vessel, bound for waters that existed at the edge of legend, or he would be dead or captured, his dreams of glory reduced to a cautionary tale told in naval academies. The fog seemed to press closer as he made his way back toward the harbor, muffling his footsteps and creating the illusion that he walked alone through a world that had been emptied of everything but shadows and possibility. Somewhere ahead, the Oath of the Dawn waited at anchor, unaware that her fate had already been decided by men who refused to accept the limitations that others took for granted. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in waters where compass needles lost their certainty and ships disappeared without explanation, the Ashen Crown continued her eternal voyage through legend and nightmare, waiting for those desperate enough to seek her out. The die, as they said, had been cast. The morning of the mutiny dawned clear and still, as if the sea itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Aren stood on the deck of the Oath of the Dawn, watching the sun climb above the harbor of Kareth's Reach, painting the water in shades of gold and amber that seemed almost too beautiful for what he was about to do. Around him, the ship's routine continued as it had for countless mornings. Sailors swabbing the deck, officers reviewing the day's assignments, the cook preparing breakfast in the galley below. None of them knew that this would be their last ordinary day aboard the vessel they had served with such loyalty. Captain Thorne emerged from his cabin precisely at 8 bells, as was his custom, and nodded to Aren with the same professional courtesy he had shown every morning for the past 2 years. "Good morning, Valen. Any developments in our investigation?" "Nothing significant, sir," Aren replied, the lie sitting heavy on his tongue, "though I may have identified a few more leads worth pursuing ashore." "Very good. Carry on." The simple exchange felt like a dagger to Aren's conscience, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. In 6 hours, when the afternoon watch began and half the crew would be ashore on liberty, he would give the signal that would transform him from loyal officer to mutinous captain. There could be no hesitation, no moment of weakness that might endanger his men or compromise their mission. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Aren attended to his duties with mechanical precision, reviewing cargo manifests and interviewing dock workers about suspicious shipping activity. But his awareness remained fixed on the careful choreography of preparation taking place around him. Dane and his recruits moved through the port with practiced casualness, gathering supplies and positioning themselves for the evening's action. By late afternoon, everything was in place. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Aren made his final preparations. In his cabin, he secured his private charts and the few personal possessions he could not bear to leave behind. The rest: uniforms, official documents, letters from home, would remain as evidence of the life he was abandoning. When future investigators tried to understand what had driven Junior Officer Aren Valen to mutiny and piracy, these remnants would tell a story of unremarkable service and sudden madness. The irony was that he had never felt more sane, more certain of his purpose. Standing before the small mirror in his cabin, adjusting his naval coat for the last time, he saw not a traitor, but a man finally ready to claim his destiny. The face that looked back at him belonged to someone who had chosen the unknown over the comfortable, legend over safety, possibility over certainty. At precisely 6 bells of the evening watch, Aren emerged onto deck to find the Oath in her customary state of reduced activity. Most of the crew were ashore, enjoying the limited pleasures that Kareth's reach had to offer. Those who remained were occupied with routine maintenance and guard duty, their attention focused inward rather than on potential threats from the port. It was exactly the situation he had been waiting for. The first phase of the mutiny unfolded with shocking efficiency. Willem Cord, approaching the ship in a small boat under the pretense of delivering supplies, was welcomed aboard by an unsuspecting watch officer. Within minutes, he had subdued the guard and signaled for the others to board. Dane and his men swarmed up the sides of the Oath like shadows given substance, moving with the silent coordination of a pack of predators. The resistance, when it came, was brief and largely ineffective. The skeleton crew remaining aboard had no reason to expect an attack from within their own harbor, no preparation for the swift and determined assault that Aren's recruits brought to bear. Those who attempted to fight were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and desperate determination. Those who showed wisdom in surrender were secured below decks with minimal harm. First Officer Calder proved to be the greatest challenge, emerging from his cabin armed and ready to defend his ship despite the hopeless odds. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. He and Aren faced each other across the quarterdeck, the loyal officer and the mutinous subordinate, duty and ambition given human form. "Stand down, Valen," Calder said, his pistol steady despite the chaos around him. "Whatever madness has taken hold of you, it's not too late to stop this." Aren drew his own weapon, though the weight of it felt strange in his hand. He had trained with firearms, of course, but never imagined he would aim one at a man he respected. "I'm sorry, Henrik, but some paths can only be walked alone. You're throwing away everything, your career, your honor, your future. For what? Some sailor's tale about ghost ships? For the chance to write my own legend," Aren replied quietly. "For the opportunity to pursue something greater than following orders and maintaining status." Whoa! The standoff ended not with violence, but with the quiet click of multiple weapons being cocked as Dane and his men surrounded the first officer. Faced with certain death and no hope of rescue, Calder slowly lowered his pistol and allowed himself to be disarmed. The defeat in his eyes was more painful to Aren than any accusation could have been. Within an hour, The Oath of the Dawn was under new management. The loyal crew members had been transferred to shore with enough money to secure passage home. Their abandoned captain and officers left to explain the loss of their vessel to naval authorities. Aren's recruits moved through the ship with practiced efficiency, familiarizing themselves with her systems and preparing for immediate departure. As darkness settled over Carith's reach, the transformed brigantine slipped her moorings and began her journey toward the open sea. Standing at the helm, Aren felt the familiar thrill of a ship under sail, but magnified beyond anything he had experienced before. This was his vessel now, crewed by men who had chosen to follow him into the unknown. Every decision, every risk, every consequence would rest on his shoulders alone. "Course, Captain?" Dane asked, the title still sounding strange but increasingly natural. Aren consulted his private charts one final time, calculating wind and current to plot their route toward waters that existed more in legend than reality. "South by southeast," he said. "We make for the deep ocean first, then begin our search for the Black Stillwater." The voyage that followed stretched across weeks that blended into months, carrying them far from familiar shipping lanes into regions where the sea took on colors and moods that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The crew of the renamed Dawn's Rebellion learned to work together through trial and necessity, their disparate backgrounds and experiences forging them into something approaching a real naval unit. But as time passed and their supplies dwindled, the enthusiasm that had carried them through the mutiny began to give way to doubt and fear. The charts that Aren consulted with such confidence proved inconsistent and contradictory, leading them in circles through empty waters where no land appeared and no other vessels were sighted. The compass, their most trusted navigation tool, began to behave erratically, spinning wildly before settling on bearings that made no navigational sense. It was Willem Cord who first voiced what they were all beginning to think. "Captain," he said during a tense gathering in Aren's cabin, "the men are starting to wonder if we're chasing shadows. We've been at sea for 3 months without finding so much as a hint of these cursed waters you promised." Aren studied the faces of his officers, for that was what they had become, bound together by shared crime and common purpose. He saw doubt there, and fear, but also a stubborn determination to see their chosen path through to its conclusion. They had burned their bridges as thoroughly as he had, transformed themselves from ordinary sailors into something between explorers and pirates. "The legends speak of patience," he said finally. "The Black Stillwater reveals itself to those who are truly lost, not merely to those who seek it for profit or glory. Perhaps we haven't yet reached that state of desperation the stories describe. And if we never do?" asked Peter Marsh, his thin face hollow with weeks of short rations and uncertainty. "If we sail in circles until our supplies run out and we die of thirst in the middle of nowhere?" It was a fair question, one that Aren had been asking himself with increasing frequency as their situation grew more precarious. But something deep in his chest, some instinct that went beyond logic or reason, insisted that they were close to their goal. The erratic behavior of their compass, the strange colors that sometimes appeared in the water at dawn and dusk, the dreams that had been haunting his sleep. All of it suggested they were approaching something significant. Then we die pursuing something meaningful, he said, echoing words he had spoken in a Kareth's Reach tavern that felt like a lifetime ago. But I don't believe it will come to that. We're closer than we know. His conviction proved prophetic in ways he could never have imagined. 3 days later, as the Dawn's rebellion sailed through waters that seemed unusually calm and quiet, the lookout called down from the crow's nest with news that sent ice through every man's veins. "Captain, island dead ahead, and there's a ship anchored beside it. The biggest damn ship I've ever seen." Aren climbed to the maintop with a spyglass, his heart hammering against his ribs as he focused on the sight that had appeared from nowhere in the perpetual mist. The island was small and rocky, little more than a jagged outcropping of stone that rose from the sea like the back of some sleeping Leviathan. But it was the vessel anchored in its shadow that stole his breath and confirmed his wildest dreams. The Ashen Crown was exactly as the legends described, and yet somehow more terrible than any story could convey. She was massive, easily 3 times the size of their brigantine, with tall masts that disappeared into the low-hanging fog and sails that seemed to be woven from shadow itself. Her hull was black as midnight, and even at a distance there was something fundamentally wrong about her silhouette. Too many angles that didn't quite make sense, proportions that hurt the eye to contemplate. "Mother of storms," Dane breathed, climbing up beside Aren with his own glass. "It's real. The cursed ship is actually real." For a moment, Aren felt only triumph, the vindication of months of planning and sacrifice, proof that his obsession had been justified. But the satisfaction lasted only until he noticed that the Ashen Crown was moving, turning toward them with impossible grace despite the absence of any wind to fill her spectral sails. "All hands on deck," he shouted, scrambling down to the quarterdeck as the crew erupted into frantic activity. "Prepare for battle! Load the guns!" What followed could barely be called a naval engagement. It was more like a force of nature asserting dominance over mortal presumption. The Ashen Crown approached with deliberate menace, her massive guns emerging from ports that seemed to open like hungry mouths. When she fired, the sound was not the familiar thunder of cannon, but something deeper and more ominous, a rumble that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The first broadside shattered the Dawn's rebellion like kindling, sending splinters of wood and metal sizing through the air in deadly clouds. Men screamed and fell, their blood spreading across decks that had been pristine moments before. Aren tried to maintain command, shouting orders and encouragement, but his voice was lost in the chaos of destruction and terror that had engulfed his ship. The second broadside broke them completely. The mainmast came crashing down in a tangle of rigging and canvas, crushing several men and rendering the ship all but unsteerable. Water poured through holes in the hull, and Aren realized with crystal clarity that his grand adventure was ending not in glory, but in disaster. He was thrown against the wheel as another impact shook the dying ship, his vision blurring as his head struck solid oak. Through the haze of pain and shock, he saw his crew, his friends, his followers, being cut down by forces beyond their comprehension. Willem Cord fell with a cry of surprise, his chest opened by a flying piece of debris. the Torres brothers disappeared beneath a collapsing section of deck. One by one, the men who had trusted him enough to follow him into legend were being claimed by the very thing they had sought. The cold took him as the dawn's rebellion finally surrendered to the sea, her broken hull sliding beneath waters that seemed eager to claim both ship and crew. Aren's last conscious thought was a recognition of terrible irony. He had sought the Ashen Crown to write his name in legend, only to discover that some legends were written in blood and shadow rather than glory and gold. Awakening came slowly, like rising from the depths of a dream too strange to be easily shaken off. Aren found himself lying on unfamiliar decks, surrounded by faces that he recognized but somehow couldn't quite place. The men who had followed him, who had died beside him, stood watching with eyes that reflected no light and skin that held no warmth. "Welcome aboard the Ashen Crown, Captain Valen," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been waiting for you." The speaker emerged from shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light, a tall figure or remains of what had once been a naval uniform, his face bearing the noble features of a man who had once commanded with honor and distinction. But there was nothing honorable about him now, nothing that spoke of the living world and its concerns. "I am Captain Erasmus Blackwater," the figure continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Once of His Majesty's Navy, now and forever commander of this vessel. You and your men have earned the right to serve aboard her through your dedication to purposes greater than mere survival." Aren tried to speak, but found his voice trapped somewhere between his mind and his mouth. The cold that filled him was not the chill of seawater or ocean air. It was something far more fundamental, the absence of warmth that came from the absence of life itself. "Do not struggle against what you have become," Blackwater advised with something that might have been kindness in a living man. "Death is not an ending here, merely a transformation. You sought the Ashen Crown because you were already lost. Lost to conventional purpose, lost to ordinary meaning, lost to the safe harbors where other men anchor their dreams. Now you have found what you were searching for." Understanding came gradually, like ice forming in his veins. The curse that bound the Ashen Crown and her crew was not punishment, but purpose. An eternal mission to sail the Black Stillwater, appearing to those who had reached the same state of desperate seeking that had driven Aren to mutiny and piracy. They were collectors of the lost, gatherers of souls who had chosen the unknown over the safe. "The legends will grow," Blackwater continued, gesturing toward waters where mist swirled in patterns that seemed almost alive. "New stories will be told in waterfront taverns and naval academies. Junior Officer Aren Valen, who stole a ship and vanished into cursed waters pursuing impossible dreams. Some will call you mad, others will call you brave, but few, a precious few, will recognize in your story the call of something greater than themselves." As the weeks and months that followed blended into years, then decades, Aren came to understand the truth of those words. The Ashen Crown continued her eternal voyage through waters that existed at the edge of reality, appearing to desperate souls who had lost their way in more than merely navigational terms. Each new crew member who joined their ranks brought stories of obsession and ambition, of dreams that had driven them beyond the bounds of prudent caution. There was Captain Maria Santos, who had sought the fountain of eternal youth and found instead eternal service. First, mate Jonathan Cross, whose pursuit of a treasure that existed only in legends had led him to a treasure of entirely different nature. Gunner Thomas Pike, who had deserted his post to chase rumors of a paradise beyond the sunset and discovered a different sort of forever. Each had been driven by the same hunger that had consumed Aren, the need to pursue something meaningful, to write their names in stories that would outlast their mortal frames. And each had found in the service of the Ashen Crown a purpose that transcended the ordinary limitations of human existence. The ship herself seemed to respond to their collective will, appearing in different waters as the decades passed, always ready to encounter the next soul who had reached that perfect balance of desperation and determination. Sometimes they would be becalmed for months in the heart of the Black Stillwater, waiting patiently for the right combination of circumstances to bring them their next recruit. Other times, they would sail with supernatural speed towards some distant encounter that Blackwater's ancient instincts had detected. Aren learned to find peace in the rhythm of eternal service, his duties as one of Blackwater's senior officers providing the sense of purpose he had always craved. But it was in the quiet moments when the Ashen Crown drifted through mists that seemed to hold fragments of every dream that had ever been abandoned that he felt closest to understanding what he had truly been seeking. He had wanted to matter, to leave some mark on the world that would survive his passing. In pursuing that goal, he had discovered that some marks were written in shadow rather than light. Some legends were whispered rather than celebrated. The Ashen Crown and her crew had become a story told in 100 ports, a cautionary tale that paradoxically inspired the very behavior it warned against. On a night when the stars seemed unusually bright above the perpetual mist, Aren stood at the rail of the great ship and watched the waters that had become his eternal home. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in harbours and taverns from Laredis to the distant southern kingdoms, sailors were telling stories about ships that vanished and crews that sought impossible things. Some would dismiss the tales as superstition, but others would listen with the kind of hunger he'd remembered feeling in his own mortal lifetime. And eventually, inevitably, one of those listeners would reach the point where ordinary purpose no longer seemed sufficient. They would gather a crew, steal a ship, and set course for waters that existed more in legend than on any official chart. They would search for months or years, driven by an obsession that others would call madness, until, finally, they found what they were looking for, or rather, until it found them. The Ashen Crown would be waiting, as she always was, crewed by souls who had chosen the unknown over the safe, the legendary over the ordinary. The encounter would be brief and decisive. Another ship claimed, another crew transformed, another chapter added to the ever-growing legend that linked the living world to the realm of eternal service. Behind them, in their wake, the stories would spread and multiply, each telling slightly different from the last, but all carrying the same essential truth. That somewhere in The Black Stillwater, dead men sailed an impossible ship, collecting souls who had proven themselves worthy of something greater than mere mortality. The legend would endure, as it always had, and grow, as it always would. As the Ashen Crown continued her voyage through waters that belonged to no earthly sea, Aren Valen, former junior officer, former mutineer, former captain, now and forever, servant of something larger than himself, smiled with the contentment of a man who had finally found his true calling. He had sought meaning in the pursuit of legend, and discovered that sometimes the seeker becomes the sought, the hunter becomes the prize, and the dreamer becomes the dream itself. In the distance, carried on winds that blew from no earthly direction, he could hear the faint sound of singing, voices raised in harmonies that spoke of journeys undertaken and destinations that existed beyond the reach of ordinary maps. It was the sound of souls who had chosen their fate. Rather than accepting what others had decided for them, voices united in service to mysteries that would outlast kingdoms and empires. The Ashen Crown sailed on through eternal mist, her wake disappearing behind her like the last traces of mortal ambition, her destination always ahead but never quite within reach. And aboard her black decks, men who had once been sailors and soldiers, merchants and fishermen, learned to find joy in the endless voyage toward horizons that promised everything and delivered exactly what each of them needed most. They had sought legend and become legend. They had pursued the eternal and found it. And in the taverns and harbors of the living world, their story continued to spread, calling to new souls who possessed the particular combination of desperation and courage necessary to sail beyond the edge of the known world in search of something worth finding. The cycle would continue, as it always had. The legend would endure, as it always would. And somewhere in the Black Stillwater, where fog never fuller lifts and compasses slowly lose their will to point north, the Ashen Crown keeps her eternal vigil, waiting for the next soul brave enough or desperate enough to come looking for her.